like to just start by saying thank you very much to everybody who's took the time to come to this presentation on the security aspects of smart cities. Hopefully some of the stuff we'll talk about here you'll find useful or pick some useful bits out, but first of all, who am I? I know some of you know me, some of you don't, but as a background, my name's Graeme Parker. As you can probably tell from the accent, I'm from the UK. Specifically live in York, which is in the northeast of England. A little bit about my background very briefly. I've been in and around the information security, or let's call it cyber security, just to excite things a little bit, since around 99, 2000. I've spent my life as a consultant in various organisations like the National Health Service in the UK, financial institutions, doing consulting for local authorities, which is a kind of a bit relevant here, and infrastructure environments. I spend my time split really between consulting, auditing and training, and I'm currently engaged with some business partners who specialise in sustainable development, and part of that partnership that we have is to bring new solutions to cities to do things like reduce their carbon impacts and things like this, which I'll talk a little bit about, and that all fits into the concept of smart cities. But of course there's one bit missing, which is the security bit, which is what I want to talk about here. So before we go off and start debating smart cities and all of this, I think it's always worth, let's be clear, what do we mean by a city? Well, problem is everybody around the world seems to have a different view, so many different descriptions depending on where you look. So you go to the UK, for example, a city, if it's got a cathedral, it's a city. It could be a very, very tiny part of the world. But the point is, it's an environment where there's usually a large collection of people, businesses and so forth. So we can have a debate about that. But in particular, what's relevant to this is the latest UN study from 2015 talks an awful lot about urbanisation, the fact that the trend is towards people moving towards city environments. So we see, today 50% of the world's population is living in cities. We're expecting to see that hit 60%. More growth in the so-called megacities, these huge conurbations that we're seeing around the world. And we're seeing rapid growth, particularly as you can see in the bottom point here, 95% of urban growth happening in developing countries. So clearly things are heading this way, and this presents many challenges and opportunities. Let's think about those challenges for just a moment. You are bringing more and more people together. Well, we're going to have competition, greater demand for things like natural resources, water, energy. We're going to see our impact on the climate increasing. We're talking about all these deals about 2% climate 2 degrees in climate change. The way things are heading at the moment, if we're not acting in the next 10 years, we've got serious problems on our hands, as some of these things tell us. But what else? The climate change impact itself, the vast majority of that impact is caused by activities taking place in cities. Other things, when we're adding more and more people into the mix, more and more people are heading to cities for work and so forth. We've got more and more competition for those resources. We see increasing social problems, risks, crimes, etc. And that impact of climate change obviously impacting on the lives and the well-being, I should say, of people who live in cities. But I'm not here just to paint a negative picture of all of this. There are absolutely lots of opportunities with city environments. It's a fantastic way of getting people to work more closely together, coming up with new ideas for new ventures, new businesses. It allows people to meet what we call their social aspirations, so people aren't isolated out in the remote parts of the country and so forth. And of course they can be excellent centres for education and learning and bringing things forward. So clearly we have many opportunities to take, and this is why you will hear an awful lot of chat and hype, I might say, about this whole topic of smart cities. And we're saying, well, we want to address all these problems by being smart. But what some companies are telling you, which is just about having internet connected devices or open Wi-Fi and all of this, that the actual aim is hopefully to deliver something a little bit more tangible, a little bit more beneficial, if you like. This actually comes from a company called NEC, who are running a number of smart city projects in India, and just a simple vision that what we're trying to talk about is systems and processes that are interconnected, that allow us to get live data. And let me give you sort of a quick example of an application of smart city technologies on a project that my colleagues are working on. And for one particular city, they're looking to reduce carbon emissions and particularly pollution from vehicles. Now, probably some of us remember, of course, with that Volkswagen scandal, that vehicle emissions, you can test your vehicle in a lab and you can produce certain results that tell you, how clean the vehicle is and so forth. But that doesn't mean anything when you compare it to the emissions from what we call real-world drive cycles. You're actually driving your vehicle on the highway, so to speak, driving your vehicle through the city streets. So this particular solution, one of the solutions as an example of a smart city application, is live sensors that will take a live picture of the vehicle as it drives through a bar or a gate, uses a laser to analyze the particulate matter and other things that are coming out the exhaust pipe, let's say, and gives a live, real-time report on the compliance or not of that vehicle. And you implement that in terms of what's called a low-emission zone. So you can find offenders, vehicles that are not meeting those low-emission standards on the fly, live, through internet-connected devices, through live monitoring. So it's just one of hundreds of examples. So, has anybody been here or heard about Masdar City? Which is great. So Masdar City was this idea. It's based just outside Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. A brand new, from scratch, sustainable city. Yes, you heard it here first, a sustainable city in the middle of an oil state, which doesn't actually burn oil. The entire city is based on solar systems, ecological systems. Buildings are built close together to allow people to walk. They're a completely interconnected environment. But you might look at that and think, well, that's all very well, but we're not going to suddenly go around the world knocking down cities and building the perfect model like this. That's not feasible, right? So we can look at everyday cities. So take Rio, for example. It's a complete opposite. City has been there for many thousands, if not hundreds of years, where we saw prior to the Olympics a deployment of all kinds of smart city solutions, from drone-based monitoring in certain areas for policing, for technologies to identify, when bins were full, so we could optimize our routes and to come out and collect rubbish and so forth. So many cities around the world, what I'm trying to say is many cities around the world are trying to adopt different technologies in order to solve their problems, become more sustainable, provide a better environment for their citizens. So that's all very well, but what we don't want is just some ad hoc, let's just deploy one or two pieces of technology. A smart city usually starts with a smart city strategy, which we'll see described in one of the British standards very shortly. But what are the things that go together to make a really smart city, if you like? For me, point number one, it's the box at the top. It's the citizens at the end of the day. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is the government or the local city authority wants to deliver services to those citizens that assist them, help them in the right direction. But it's not simply a case of a government coming along and doing what I call a top-down approach. Here's what we're going to do. This is the technology we go to deploy. There are many examples in various countries of what we call bottom-up development. This is where people themselves actually get together to look at city-based problems and actually design solutions. One of them I'll mention at the end in the Netherlands is an organisation called the Vaag Society. And what they do is they're very keen on, for example, sharing items. So they've actually created a sort of a core network across the city where you can loan each other equipment, for example, gardening equipment and so forth. A very small thing, a very smart idea to solve local problems. But in reality, we still need a level of leadership and strategy at the city level. So city authorities actually setting that tone and direction and saying, what are the key problems we're trying to solve, and how do we engage the citizens in solving those problems? And we need the kind of environment that allows business to work and to raise funding. So a lot of these projects I'm talking about, for example, you can raise funding through particularly climate projects, through climate bonds, green bond markets and so forth, so you can actually invest in something sustainable that gives a return to the investors and the people within the city. But the bit we're interested in here, which is why I underlined it, obviously, is I can have all the technology in the world and all the greatest ideas in the world. We're all security professionals, we know this stuff here, that the whole thing will not work without taking into account adequate thoughts about security and privacy, and also ethics. Ethics is a big thing here. We're going to be collecting potentially personal data. We'll talk a little bit about that shortly. If you think you're using data that citizens provide, for example, we've got to make some certain judgments about what are ethical decisions. When can I use that data and what for? How does that perhaps affect the privacy of somebody's life? And I'll give a sort of a real world example of a privacy impact on that very, very shortly. And of course, like any other system, this is just a system, we need to have some kind of way of deciding, well, what are our goals and how are we going to measure those? Of course, we can use a lot of the technology to gather the data to do that. But the question you might ask is, well, how do I equip the city, if you like, and the people to start coming up with these solutions, designing solutions and so forth? Well, it's a big argument here. And this probably runs contrary to what every security professional is taught, and that is this concept of open data. And the idea of open data is that organisations, city authorities, councils, governments, etc., can take non-personally identifiable information, this is the thing, anonymised data, and provide that to any developer, group of people, organisation that wants to use it. So some simple things that, of course, are already open. Schedules of public transport, that's open data. Healthcare statistics, so not personal health details, but statistics. These things can serve as open data. So there is a whole organisation that looks at this issue called the Open Data Institute, and their ideas play a massive role. If you're going to design a smart city strategy, you need to be familiar with this concept. But let's just get on to the core point about this. We said that we want to think about the security aspects. And if you remember the talk by Eric Cole just over the lunch, what did he say? One of the things he was saying was that before we start doing anything with security, we need to understand what our assets are. Now this is a bit of a challenge here because I sat down and had to think about it, and I thought, okay, let's imagine I'm in the position of let's say I'm a security manager or consultant advising, a city authority. Where am I going to start with a security program? Well, I'm probably going to start by identifying the assets. The problem is, not all of those assets belong to us. Those assets are distributed. So, yes, as a city, we might own some of the, some of the databases, some of the sensor systems and CCTV cameras or whatever else it might be, but we might be working with citizens who are carrying data around on their phones, who are sharing that data with us. That's their asset. I might be working with third parties who are publishing open data or writing applications for us. Well, in that case, those are their assets. So we're not going to have a one-size-fits-all approach, but that doesn't stop us as a city authority coming up with a security strategy and thinking about how we can protect the stuff that we're responsible for, but also how we can engage these other parties and encourage and engage them to take their level of responsibility. So let's play that out a little bit further then, okay? We know that in any kind of security program, we've got to think about the threats, where the threat's coming from. We know this, we're well versed on this as security practitioners. We have the official definition from ISO 27000 about what a threat is. The trouble is, in these environments, you think about some of the systems I've just been talking about, infrastructure systems, smart transportation systems that affect traffic lights and things like this. And actually, you think about the threats there, they can be much wider and much, much more effective. And you might ask, well, where do those threats particularly come from? Well, pretty much similar to a threat to an organisation, except I would say here, this could be certain systems may be a very interesting target for things like organised terrorist groups, nation states. These in particular could be a prime target. I mean, imagine if you could you disable a city infrastructure by carrying out a denial of service attack, or launching some ransomware, not to take the money, but in order to cause some havoc and chaos and disruption. It's not beyond reasonable thought that this could certainly happen. So, if we accept that, which hopefully I could convince you that that is the case, then I think what we agree upon, or hopefully will agree upon, is that the city authority needs to think about establishing a security program for the city. So what do I mean by a security program? Well, that term program implies straight away that I'm talking about a recurring set of activities to constantly identify, manage risk, support our citizens, be prepared to respond to incidents, and so forth. And one of the things we're going to have to do fairly early on is identify, well, who are the key stakeholders who are going to play a role in this program? Because it's not just, as we've said, it's not just the government. So whilst we can set down some kind of security policy, we need to be mapping out who those stakeholders are first, looking at how they all interact with the different systems that we've got, so we have a good idea about how we can move this program forward. And one of the things that got me thinking when I thought, well, okay, we could have a security program for a city, but where are the standards? Because in our industry, and you've been to some of the other talks earlier on, we have information security standards that we can use for an organisation at that level. Well, the truth is there are some standards to do with smart cities, although I'm not sure they tell me an awful lot about the security program, being quite honest with you. So I'll tell you about what standards are out there so you're aware. Certainly, so British Standards Institute has done some work with industry within the UK to create what we call a PAS, or a publicly available specification. So a PAS actually is almost like a forerunner to an official standard. The next one gives me some information about data sharing in particular. If you think about an environment like a city, the example given in one of these standards was, let's imagine that you've got lots of citizens driving around and they're using Twitter, for example, to complain about traffic congestion or roadworks in a certain area. Well, you can actually extract that information. You can look at the volume of those complaints, for example, to identify where your key problems are. But obviously all that data that you're gathering needs to be marked up in a certain way. It needs to be formatted correctly. And this is what PAS 182 drives at. And the next one, Hypercut. Has anybody come across Hypercut before? Have you played with it, seen it? So this is a standard particularly where IoT, Internet of Things developers, if you like. Obviously the thing about Internet of Things devices is they need to be able to talk to one another, and the challenge is if you've got 100 different manufacturers building devices on their own architectures, there's a chance we don't have interoperability. So Hypercut, whilst they are not answering the problem of the security program, this whole program, at least from a technology point of view, we've got something we can look at. I'm not saying it's the answer, but it's something we can look at. So, and also the International Telecommunications Union within the UN also have a number of focus groups that are trying to pull together standards. So standards are coming. In the interim though, what do we need to think about? Well, I'm not going to stand and read all these standards to you because the fact is the vast majority of you know these standards inside out anyway. I just thought I would put this in here to say, whilst these are not designed for smart cities, I do feel that some of them would still, the common sense that's within them, the approach to building a security program, we can still leverage the best bits of these standards. And in particular, the third one there, the NIST SP 882, is targeted at how you protect or implement a program to protect industrial control systems. So we typically think of industrial control systems as information systems that control things like, for example, railroad systems, electricity substations and so forth. So they're not data systems that store personal information. These are process control systems. This is going to be very relevant in an Internet of Things connected city environment. The actual entire program that NIST suggests is not designed for that, but again, you can leverage a lot of the good practice in there. But I did kind of put the question on the bottom, where are our IoT security standards? The answer is in various stages of development, depending on where you look. And this is something that, and I'm sure other members of PECB can tell you a bit more about. This is a problem that PECB themselves are working on to try and produce some guidance for the industry in this area. So there's certainly a huge development towards that. So let's just think about a typical security program, or what I think. So instead of, well, not a typical security program, I should say, start again. You know, if I could talk all day about a standard security program. So let's pick out the bits that are more relevant, in my opinion, for a smart city. You know, if I'm going to develop a security program for that purpose. Some of these are clear. The one, of course, that I've highlighted very much in the bold there is the whole sort of citizen education and engagement. We'll have a look at some examples of that in just a moment. We'll talk through these just very, very briefly, and I'll kind of stop at the ones that I feel are particularly more relevant, and I've got a couple of examples of where we've worked with this. So like any other standard organisation, nothing changes here. We'd start our security program by understanding what our roles and responsibilities and our accountabilities are, the traditional RACI matrix. This time, however, I've got my city authorities, I've got my vendors, my IoT partners. If some cities have took the decision to partner with the likes of IBM and people like this, well, in which case I've got my vendors and all of those people in the supply chain involved. In some cases, what we've seen is, I can point to Birmingham, for example, in the UK, where a large UK-based outsourcing provider actually set up a joint venture organisation with the city council so that there was shared risk. There was shared risk in the project of driving innovation into the city. So it really depends on the structures, what those roles and responsibilities look like. But we need to be clear on where that's set, who's going to be making the decisions. And one of the ones that I should have probably put on the slide, I'm thinking about it now, is some kind of technical design authority. The thing for me is where these big infrastructure decisions are made, where is that sign-off coming, who's the technical design authority, and have we got, as part of that technical design authority, some kind of reference to security architecture or security teams who can inform that architecture. And that would then suggest, I think, that if I'm going to have a security architecture and I'm going to have a design authority and a way of building this and building it up in a logical architecture-driven approach, then I'm going to do some kind of security by design. In other words, probably every security practitioner, and you guys yourself probably preach this, but every security project from day one, it's not a security project, every project, I should say, from day one needs to engage the expertise of those security architects, those people who can advise right throughout the design, development and deployment. And there are a few key points about that. Making sure that we have defined a clear security architecture that lays out kind of our standard non-functional security requirements. So, for example, we may say certain elements of networks may need to be encrypted by default, certain data at risk may be protected in a certain way, and that might be our default non-functional requirements. We may then build additional requirements, obviously depending on the applications or the software or the devices that we're deploying. But when I look at this, obviously a lot of this is dependent on vendors. As we said, a city authority doesn't build this by themselves. They engage strategic partners, they engage some big technology companies. So I think the city authorities have a duty, in my opinion, to be doing their due diligence. Maybe not in the style of Robert Monsieur, perhaps, but doing their due diligence on that supply chain, making sure that we are talking to those providers in advance before we sign that contract about what our minimum expectations are from those vendors, challenging them to meet those requirements, challenging those vendors to understand these standards and be part of the process and bringing them with us. So it's the city authority leading the vendors, not the vendors, as we've said some programs in India, for example, where the vendor leads the city. That's not really leading to the outcome that we saw at the start, that smart city vision. And I mentioned this bottom point, second bottom point, considering an accreditation strategy. What do I mean by that? Because that word means different things to different people. So I'll apologise now if I'm being a bit UK-centric in this, but what we mean by accreditation, certainly from a UK government point of view, and you probably have things that are very similar here, is on large important projects within government environments. What we do, we have a risk assessment process which is done by security professionals. We design our security architectures, but then a totally separate individual who works on behalf of the government, who is a trained security practitioner, will look at the risks at each stage of development and will basically have the power to say yes or no, this project will or will not go live. Or it can go live, but X, Y, and Z needs to be done from a security perspective. And that accreditor, especially in these critical projects, has the authority to stop a project in its tracks where we're taking unacceptable risks. And obviously that sounds very simple, but clearly if we're going to deploy something like that, we need what I call an accreditation strategy. Which of these projects, we might not need to accredit every single system, but I would certainly expect some of the core infrastructure projects for cities to be subject to formal accreditation before they're authorised to go live. And really, I probably shouldn't have put the last point in there, but everywhere I go at the moment, all I hear is, this is irrelevant because we do Agile. Agile means you don't design anything. Agile means you don't test anything. Absolute nonsense. Absolute sheer utter nonsense, because at the end of the day, although Agile doesn't work in that traditional waterfall model, there's absolutely no reason why we cannot have embedded into those Agile project teams security experts or people with the knowledge, and there's no reason why at the end, before we go live, we still can't have a pre-approval and an ongoing accreditation strategy. All it means is perhaps we need to approach the project as a security team in a more effective manner. But certainly it's not a reason to throw everything I've just said out of the window, let me put it that way. So that was my rant of the afternoon. So we'll do any more on that. Something else though that I think is key in a smart city project here. Let's think about all these different technologies you're deploying. Okay, let's think just for a moment about the potential privacy impact on an individual. And so the idea of a privacy impact assessment is where we take the time to look at a project, look at what we're doing with that personal data, and make a decision on whether that could have an adverse impact on the actual person themselves. Let me give you a real-world example where we did a privacy impact assessment and where I'm coming from here. So one of the projects I was involved in was to do with basically a vehicle bridge crossing, okay, which was tolled. So basically every time anybody drove across the bridge, they had to pay, and traditionally they'd drive up to the bridge and pay with cash. So quite an anonymous transaction really. But the problem was we were getting tailbacks of traffic for miles and miles where people were handing over notes and getting their change. So the authority involved said, right, what we're going to do, we're going to stop all that. We're going to get rid of the people who work on the tolls, and we're going to have an automated system. Okay. So what you can do, you go online, pay in advance for your toll crossing with a credit card. You can create an account on the website. And you could say, well, I cross it every day, so I'll just become a subscriber. I could buy a black box to put in my car to track me crossing. And if I don't do any of that, I could still drive across and pay within 24 hours of crossing, because there will be an automatic number plate recognition system. So, and if I don't pay, then I can receive a fine through the post because I haven't paid the bill. Sounds like a great system, yeah? A lot more efficient, a lot more quick. But the problem is now the anonymity for those people potentially crossing that bridge is gone. Now you might say, well, what's the privacy impact of that? Now, I might sound a bit flippant of me to say it, but let's imagine that perhaps an individual is, visiting somewhere or someone they shouldn't be. Let's just put it that way. That information comes out. I'm not advocating that people do things they shouldn't be, but I think what I'm trying to say is, this, in all seriousness, if information is released about people's moves, it could have an impact on that individual's privacy. Now, the decision was made that on the whole, in the scheme of things, the benefits kind of took precedent. But my point is, there always should be that kind of balanced discussion, and a privacy impact assessment is the way to deliver that. I've referenced, of course, the UK Information Commissioner's guidance, but most information commissioners in Europe provide plenty of guidance on privacy impact assessment. You can also have a look at ISO 29100 for a more international view on this as well. So some key things to think about. Vendor management, I've already talked about the importance of that. In many cases, if you do this right, you can get a lot of vendor commitment by, as I say, perhaps making the vendor a stakeholder, like the Birmingham example I gave there, where we basically, I was working for the large outsourcer. We really couldn't mess the city about in that case because we become part of that joint venture. So if we're not delivering value, the joint venture isn't delivering value, nobody's profiting. So one way of actually tying in the vendors maybe to look at those kind of approaches, but there's all kinds of different governance approaches here, public-private partnerships and so on that can do that. But whatever you do, it is down to the city authority to really work with those vendors. Of course, obviously then, we know that we've got a bit of a lack of standards here. We know that stuff's kind of happening here and there. I think as well that city authorities they do have a role to play in this. Clearly, if we're doing a security program, we want standards, we want laws and regulations, and it's a great opportunity really for city authorities to be lobbying, to be working with the likes of ISO, for example. I know Anders did a very good talk on that earlier about the importance of the right groups talking to ISO about requirements. And of course, we can look at sector level, so PECB developing IoT standards, or perhaps multinationally, we know that work's going on, for example, within the European Union, probably something as a Brit I should be embarrassed to talk about right now, but yeah, you get the idea. There are many opportunities to forge policy and guide policy in the right way, because it's all a little bit fluid at the moment. But there's one or two other things I just wanted to talk about. We talk about smart cities, but we don't really have a smart city unless I have what you might call smart citizens. In other words, people who want to take part in this, want to use those technologies, or maybe even want to contribute. And we typically say there are four kind of categories here. So the consumer is, well, we're all consumers. If we use the bus network, for example, and use the free Wi-Fi, I'm a consumer, I'm using a service. If I drive across that bridge and pay for my toll crossing, I'm a consumer. You've got producers, those who produce the open data and share that data. And possibly you've got consumers being a producer as well, or a prosumer as we call it. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's imagine I'm a citizen and I'm busy tweeting about the traffic congestion, as I said earlier. Well, I might be using city services. I'm also contributing my data. I'm actually producing something that other people can use. So I'm kind of in both. And we may have a number of different creators who create the information, that open information that we can all use. But the point is, that's not really going to work unless we have some programs to engage and educate and work with those citizens. And there's a few fantastic examples out there. One of them I point to, UK example, is the organisation called Smart Citizen. It's what we call community platforms. This is a charitable organisation that developed this to allow the citizens to get closer to government, to talk to government. One of the things I have right on my phone is an app which some of you may have used called Fix My Street, for example. Wherever I'm out and about and I spot, some hole in the road or some litter dumped on the sidewalk, I can literally just take the picture, upload it immediately to a central database. It basically calculates through geolocation where I am, where the local council is. It informs them pretty much immediately, and it works. The amount of time the main road near where I live is full of litter that people throw out the window, and they do pretty much react fairly reasonably in cleaning it up. This is a way of engaging the citizen, giving them the tools to use. But it's important that those projects, those city leaders who are setting up these projects, do think very carefully about all age groups, all sectors of society, because we have this argument about digital exclusion. Here we all are, we're IT professionals, easy for us. But what about perhaps elderly or disabled people who might not be able to use such technologies in such ways? We're seeing some good actions in some local authorities in terms of giving free lessons on use of technology, giving free guidance, that kind of thing. So there's many of those. There are many community groups. I mentioned the Varg Society earlier on. You can have a look at them online. This is a group of citizens in Amsterdam who've basically decided to solve their own problems. And some councils and authorities are also having what we call hackathons. Maybe you've been to one of those or you've seen them. The idea of a hackathon is where it's not about hacking. It's actually about getting people together who have ideas and development skills, basically getting them all to come together for a day to solve a particular problem. So I think there's one example I saw in the US where, maybe I've been in New York, where they got a bunch of people together to create an app essentially that allowed people to buy produce from local food producers, for example. And the idea was to reduce the carbon emissions, if you like, of imported food. So there are many different things we can do, but of course security awareness campaigns within the actual communities is another big thing as well. We actually see, again, you've probably done it in many other countries. We see in the UK, for example, Cyber Streetwise as being a really very good piece of work that the government has done to try and raise awareness of basic cyber hygiene for citizens, not for businesses, although they do stuff for that as well. And they do a lot of radio and television adverts and so forth. So they really are trying to get to the actual citizen on the ground. So these are things we can do. I am conscious of time. Obviously, I think most of us know about incident and disaster recovery. In fact, the last presentation was all about business continuity, so I really won't take up any time on that. I think we understand that that's part of the project. So there's just two sort of final points I would make a couple of slides just to sum it up. That smart city security is definitely a multi-stakeholder activity. It is not just down to the local government to deal with. It takes a lot of leadership from the city, but also engagement with the people and the vendors to make it work. It isn't just about protecting data either. I think that's the thing. We talk a lot about information security. Yes, we're protecting information, but in this environment, with all the different things we're deploying, we are trying to protect citizens and all the things that citizens depend on, those critical services. So it's a multidisciplinary activity, not a technical activity, not a policy activity, not a political activity, involving all kinds of groups. An industry as a whole, and I guess that's a call to people in PECB as well, need to be thinking about, well, where do we go from here to create the right standards, to build on some of the work, to be fair, has already been done. And I guess my final point sounds a bit cliched, but ultimately a smart city is a secure city. So on that note, I'd like to say thank you very much and ask if there's any questions. Is there any question? Question at the back.
Okay, so this is regarding one of your initial slides with reference to Indian smart city. I'm asking this because I'm an Indian citizen and I know that currently Indian government is working on around 100 smart cities.
Yeah.
And they have significantly increased the use of digital technologies and Wi-Fi and many other things, right? So if you are working on one of the project of the smart cities, I wanted to know whether they comply with all the necessary security standards. What is their plan?
That's a good question. I'm not working on any Indian smart cities, so it'd be very difficult for me to stand here and say yes or no in terms of compliance. Certainly, my understanding from the reading and research I do that there is an awareness, let's say, of security activities. I know particularly in India, a lot of the projects are led by the big vendors. I think there's a big strategic tie-up with IBM. But whether I can say whether those projects are compliant, I think it'd be a bit brave of me to give a straight answer on that. Okay. Any other questions or queries? All right, in which case, say thank you very much, and I'll let you go to the next discussion. Thank you. Right. Thank you.